as I've been going through this next phase of what God has me doing here, and the requirement to be purified, made spotless, and refined, and the testing and the crushing that God is bringing me through in order for that to happen, one of the feelings that I've felt in this process is anger. Anger and confusion and just, wondering, like, I'm testing myself every single day. I'm making sure that I'm doing this correctly. I'm doing it the way that you are leading me, or that he is leading me. And there's not a single thing. There's not a single thing that I would look back on and say, yeah, maybe I didn't do that right, or maybe I heard this wrong. And so there's this part of me that's like, why haven't you fulfilled yet? Why haven't you maintained your end of this contract, this covenant, and the things that you've promised me? Not only the things that you've promised me directly, but the things that you've promised me in your word. It's not as though I made decisions that I wanted to make. It's not as though I made decisions that I justified because it was something that I wanted to do. The decisions that I made, I didn't want to make. So I'm certain this wasn't my idea. But as I look to scripture to help me to understand what God is dragging me through, and of course I say that sort of tongue in cheek because yes, he's dragging me through a lot. He's testing me. He's putting me through the fire. I don't believe that God would disagree with that statement because that's what he says in the word, that he's going to put us through the fire. But he also promises he's going to be with us when we go through the fire, that the water, and when we go through the waters, and the waters will not sweep over us. So he's putting me through it, and he's pushing me all the way to the very end of what is necessary in order for me to reach into those places inside of me and process things that not only would I not be motivated to do, but I would not even be able to reach those places inside of myself without going to the limits that he's pushed me to. It's very important, and I share this with you in testimony because you are going to go through it too. If you are in him, you're going to go through it too. God's judgment begins with his church first. Don't be surprised at the fiery trial that's now come upon you. Everything in scripture tells us that this is what we should expect, that we need to pick up our cross, that we are going to experience the things that early Christians experienced at this time in history. Why did our parents and grandparents and the generations before us not experience this? Because there has been a period of time on this earth in which counterfeit Christianity was established through the harlot Catholic Church and continues in the prostitutes that bore out of her, those who call themselves reformists. If you're returning to God, which is your covenant, there's no reason for you to reform anything. If you are reforming something, it's because your focus is not on God. And if you need more evidence that these are the prostitutes that bore out of her, think about what prostitution means in the word. It means that you've prostituted yourself to the world. It means that you are committing adultery with the enemy of God, and that you have inherently made yourself an enemy to him. Now, what does prostitution mean? You're lukewarm, you're double-minded. You think that you can have Christianity and the world. But the covenant of circumcision that God extended to through Abraham to us means that we don't make decisions according to what our flesh wants. So when I say to you, I know the decisions that I made, and I know that I made them with God, and I know that I heard from God, and I'm not wavering on that. I'm not suddenly saying, well, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I didn't hear right. Maybe I did. No, I heard right because I didn't want to make the decisions that I made. I made those decisions because I am circumcised in heart from the desires of my sinful flesh. And believe me, I know the difference because I lived according to my sinful flesh for a very long time. So as I've been taking this up with him on a daily basis, yesterday he began to tell me that I need to lean into what he's purifying out of me right now. Because I also know that part of my covenant is to be purified, made spotless, and refined. I learned that from Daniel 11 and Daniel 12 when Jesus is telling Daniel that this is what's going to happen with the wise. This is your covenant. And if you think that you don't have an infinite number of things to be purified, made spotless, and refined out of you, you are delusional. Like if you think, I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. Like I'm saved, like the counterfeit Christians like to say that they're already saved, even though you ask them, well, what does that mean? What have you been saved from? They can't answer your question. What are you still doing here? So he said to me that I need to lean into that. He's doing something here. I shared with you about a week or two ago that he raised a metaphor or parable in my lived experience, telling me things are not what they seem. When I was asking him, are you going to break me? Are you crumbling my house? Are you going to break my faith? And he said, things are not what they seem yet. So I've had to really tune myself into him to understand what he's doing as we're going. And I've had to deal with a lot of different feelings. And I've had to deal with my past traumas and the things that have come up around my relationship with my dad that I have projected onto God. And no, it's not enough to just, how many times have people tried to do this to say, oh, well, God is different from my parent? Yeah, no, duh. People do that all the time in relationships. Well, my spouse is not my parent, but you still have those feelings that come up and they still compel you in different directions when you have not healed. I know I have to actually heal from those things, which means I have to acknowledge how I feel and I have to examine who I've been as a result of that. And I have to learn from God why it is that he sent certain experiences in my life. Then the symptoms will relent. Then the bondage and the compulsion will relent because Satan would lose his rights to torment me for not having received the ministry of God and done the work that I need to do. So this process, this has been going on over a year in this specific situation of my housing situation. And is God going to take care of me or not? Because no one else is going to take care of me. There aren't enough believers in the world at this point to take care of God's servants. I can tell you that confidently. Nor have I required you to. Nor have I asked anybody for anything. Because like Paul, I haven't wanted to prohibit anybody from receiving whatever it is that God has built in me and so freely given to me. Not only that, but I spent a lot of time in my life in idolatry of man, thinking, oh, I need this and I need that. And the only way that I'm going to be taken care of is if a human being does this and that. Well, that is one of the biggest things that God has been rooting out of me in this whole experience. And at the very beginning, he said to me, you cannot be afraid. You must not be afraid of man, afraid of the devil, or trust man. And that has consistently been what I have reminded myself of the entire time. And if you're actually living that out, you're going to realize that God is he's rooting out idolatry of experts. Am I going to go and consult with a legal expert about what's going on here? I mean, I don't have the money to do that anyway, so that's the whole point. But I mean, there are people, I know people who work in law who I could consult with, but God told me from the very beginning, you are not to fear man, you are not to trust man, you are not to fear the devil. Okay, so that's required me to anchor myself to that instruction every single time something new happens. My house went into foreclosure, my house has been auctioned. But because of the things that God has told me, I know I'm not going to leave this house. And so there's also been, things that I've thought about, like, my goodness, I wouldn't even go to jail for something that I've done. I feel like the authorities would send me to a psych ward and I'd be shot up with medications for what I believe. Is that what God's going to do to me? Come on, guys. Is that what he's going to do? But it sounds pretty bananas, doesn't it? It sounds pretty crazy. You ever heard of someone doing what I've done? Probably not. And my daughter and I were talking the other day about, well, there have been people who've believed this and that, but you have to be able to distinguish between what I've done and what other people have done. Other people have followed cult leaders who exploited them for money and sex and other things, but those are the two main things. Other people were not standing on the word of God, or they would have known that what they were doing was incorrect, that it wasn't in line with God's word. I haven't received from anybody but God in his word. Other people were making decisions that they wanted to make, not decisions that they didn't want to make. So you have to distinguish the fruit. It is a really hard thing to do, to stand right now under the conditions that I'm under. And I have to continually go back to scripture and look at okay, well, what is God established? Is this biblical or not? Because this has to be biblical. If I can't find this in the Bible, something's wrong. One of the scriptures that I'm reminded of quite often, especially when I'm dealing with arrogant people or people who want to tell me how to do the ministry, that, listen, if God has anointed me, if he set me apart to do something, he's the one who keeps me in line. No human being is going to go to someone, is going to go to any of the servants in the Bible and go tell them, can you imagine them going to Jeremiah and saying, you're doing this wrong, you're not speaking kindly about your warning to us. God says to Ezekiel, I'm sending you the people of Israel, not a people of obscure speech and strange language, but the people of Israel. They should understand what you have to say, basically. And you are to say to them what I tell you to say. And if you don't say it, their blood's going to be on your head. But if you do say it and they die, they don't listen, their blood will be on their own head. You are to say what I tell you to speak to them, whether they listen or they fail to listen. And they're not going to listen to you because they don't listen to me. So I get a lot of messages from people who want to tell me how to do the ministry, tell me that I'm doing it wrong, because they're leaning on their own understanding. And a lot of times what I have experienced is that people are feeling convicted and they think that I somehow have the ability to convict them. If you've done something wrong, you're going to feel convicted. If you haven't, you're not going to feel anything. You're just going to be like, that doesn't apply to me. What does that have to do with me or any of God's messengers? So Paul was dealing with some people who were criticizing him. That's clear. When he's saying, I, Paul, who am so timid when I'm with you, but so bold in my letters. The people were talking smack. They were criticizing the way that Paul does things. Who kept Paul in line? Who's the one who disciplines his servants? Is it even realistic for the very people whom the servants are warning to tell the servant how to warn them? I mean, that's just goofy. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8, already you have what you want. Already you've become rich. You've begun to reign, and that without us. He's a little sarcasm there, huh? Listen to what he says about what this is like, being a servant of God. How I wish that you had really begun to reign so that we might also reign with you. For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession like those condemned to die in the arena. We've been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as human beings. We're fools for Christ, but you're so wise in Christ. We're weak, but you're strong. You're honored, we're dishonored. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty. We're in rags, we're brutally treated, we're homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we're cursed, we bless. When we're persecuted, we endure it. When we're slandered, we answer kindly. We become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to this moment. Right, so I say the same thing to you. You know, I have to make decisions that my flesh doesn't want to make, i.e., I have to circumcise from the desires of my sinful flesh and live in the heart and spirit. You know, the spirit that does the things is willing to do the things of God. The heart where he's cleaning me up. Oh, but you're a believer with your jingle bell around your neck. You're a believer celebrating your pagan holidays. Me over here, I withhold from myself on God's holy days. Isn't this what counterfeit Christianity loves to do? Gentile Christians, they love to say, oh no, that was the responsibility of Jews. It's different now. We have science, we have holidays. It's no longer illegal to be a Christian. God made a way for us to be just like the world, to fit right in. No, he didn't. He established counterfeit Christianity, which made it legal to be a counterfeit Christian. Because early Christians, let me read to you what was going on. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And that's just talking about early Christians. Let's just scroll up a little bit in Hebrews 11, and let's see what Paul has to say about faith. He talks about faith being confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. You can't have faith in something that's already in your hands, in something that you have already carnally received. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. By faith, Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he's dead. I want you to think about the examples and the servants that God has used and what they went through. Abel was murdered by his brother. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as someone who pleased God, and without faith it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. If you don't obey him, you don't believe in him. If you're not withholding from yourself, if you're not picking up your cross, if you're not experiencing the fiery trial, it's because you don't believe. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. What was Noah going through? Everybody thought he was an idiot. They all thought he was nuts till they were drowning in the water. While him and his family were safe and sound inside the ark, they had every opportunity. Noah warned them. Hear what I'm saying to you, because I've been warning you. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. You think people might have thought he was a little nuts? By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Do you think that his children, even believing, because I have this experience with my children believe, and I know that they believe because I see the way that they live. Every single one of us are doctors. We joke about the fact that we've all given up our doctorates. And my little grandson, Jeremiah, who's almost 2, we joke about the fact that this child is probably going to go to people and say, yeah, my parents are doctors. Oh yeah, what do? They deliver food. My grandma's a doctor. What does she do? She bakes bread. She uses the blower to clean up the yard. I mean, it's kind of funny because that's what Jeremiah is obsessed with. Like, he's so obsessed with the blower. So these are the things he'd be focused on. This child is not growing up in the world like we did. He's growing up with godly people who have degrees. Every single one of us has a doctorate. Every single one of us gave it up for God. To live in poverty. To go and humble ourselves and deliver food. So that we're not compromising ourselves by performing procedures and leading God's people astray and setting ourselves up as idols. Because that's what each of our respective fields taught us to do. Taught us was esteemable in the world. And we bought into that lie. But once God shows you, there's no turning back. My children are telling me today that they've taken hits on their credit because Sally Mae is so filthy and disgusting that they will not make a deal. They don't have an arrangement for people who don't have money. They can't apparently utilize a forbearance because you would have to make a certain amount of money in order to apply for the forbearance. That's what those disgusting people did, because there is not a template for God's people in this world. So God's going to make one. He's going to make one because that's what his word says. By faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. His children surely believed because they lived with him. My children believe, but if there are times when we start wondering, okay, we all haven't gone crazy, have we? And then we have to remind ourselves that God built a testimony in every single one of us. No one just readily accepted the crazy things that I have to say. My daughter came in first. Then my daughter and I pleaded with her husband, pleaded with him, begged him, please understand this. Didn't matter how much pleading we did with him, because you can't know Christ until Christ introduces himself to you. And because he was willing to continue to pursue Christ, Christ is not the liar, by the way. He says that he won't turn away anyone who comes to him. And he didn't. He revealed himself. And each one of us has our own testimony that was not something we were coerced in. It was not something that we could have just decided to believe because someone we love believed. Because that isn't the integrity. That's not the heart that we have. And yet there are certain dynamics here that I'm experiencing with my children that are really hard. Each one of us wants to take care of the other, and we can't because there's no template for God's people. None of us can take care of the other, and each one of us would lay down our life for the other. It's a hard thing. And yet there have been multiple people who have come in to the body and eaten at the same table, and there were hard lines they weren't willing to cross with their own children. They were not willing to bear their own children. They were not willing to confront their own children. They were not willing to examine their own sins so that curses could be broken off of their children. Abraham was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful, who made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. Now, here's what I want to say to you. What I'm going through right now and what you will go through is a shadow of what's to come. It is a shadow of what you're going to be brought through in order to be tested. Because you're going to be longing for the day that Jesus comes back when you're going through that Antichrist reign and when you're going through the 45 days prior to Jesus coming, the 1290th day to the 1335th day, the Great Tribulation. You're going to be longing for Christ to come back, and you're going to wonder, am I crazy? Have I believed in vain? Did I hear right? Have I done right? You're going to be tested to see if you will actually believe that you will be saved. Or are you going to turn back and rely on Egypt or the king of Assyria? Are you going to turn back and rely on those things? I don't know about you, but I lived a very glamorous life, a very quote-unquote comfortable life financially. Even if all of that was restored to me, I could not go back. Because now that I know what the truth is, there's no turning back. It's not an option for me. Even if it was a physical option, it's not an option in my heart. But see, God's going to have to bring us to places where we're tested and purified and made spotless and refined. He's going to have to bring us to those places where every remnant of doubt, every remnant of unbelief is going to be purified out. What he brought me to today and what he was telling me to study today has to do with fear and the thing that he says over and over, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of this people. And as I was reading, I was discovering that from the very beginning of God calling this nation of Israel, this nation set apart to him, from the very beginning of him teaching them what he requires, this is one of the first things he taught them was do not be afraid of man. The very instruction that he gave me at the beginning of this sort of set of trials. Do not be afraid of man and do not trust man. So it's not just me that has been idolatrous of human beings in my life. This is a tendency of the flesh that needs to go. To be very honest, when I finally had the money to pay for things like experts and attorneys and consultants and things like that, they never led me correctly anyway. Maybe they led me correctly according to what their training was in the world, but God foiled all of it. And I'm actually really grateful for that their advice and their suggestions and their expertise never amounted to anything but leading me in a direction I shouldn't have gone. Because God conformed it in the other direction because I didn't go to him. And in doing so, he has tamed me. He has disciplined me to rely on him alone. Now, one of the biggest things that we went through since Christ has drawn me and my family to him was the birth of Jeremiah. When my children were still in this field of medicine, and I had been telling them, this is of the devil. It's of the devil. Science, the field that denies Christ, that denies that there is a creator who is Christ, which fundamentally means that that's Antichrist. the covenant that God established with us. I am the Lord your healer. If you obey me and follow my decrees, that I will not put on you any of the diseases that I put on the Egyptians. I'm the Lord who heals you. When I send these things to the earth, when I start harming the earth, if my people who are called by my name will turn to me and turn from their wicked ways. Why is he talking about their wicked ways? How does he know that they've been wicked? Because that's the reason he's sending these things. That's the covenant. Then he will restore you. Then he will heal you. Oh, but no, there's a field called science that replaces him. Many fields, many experts. They're going to be brought down. God says so in his word. He says that he's going to smash all of those Asherah poles, all of those idols, and we'll be throwing them out like a menstrual cloth. It's already happening. And there's a couple things also that, kind of parables that he's created in the world or in the concrete for us to recognize. In 2021, he brought down that Darwin arch in I think it's in the Galapagos Islands. Crushed it, dropped it into the sea. Is there a message there? On Christmas Eve, he caught the Eiffel Tower on fire. So I was a little curious about, what's the significance of the Eiffel Tower? And I learned that it was built to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution and for the 1889 Exposition Universelle, also known as the Paris Exposition. And that this was a World's Fair held in Paris, France, from May to October, and it was the fifth of 10 major expositions held in Paris between 1856 and 1937. So I'm just pulling this from Google. The exposition celebrated the 100th anniversary of the start of the French Revolution and featured many notable achievements in science, industry, and the arts. Now, let me ask you something. Science, industry, and the arts. Has science done anything for faith? No. It has set many idols up and pulled you away from relying on God. What about the Industrial Revolution? What about industry? No, you're no longer relying on the rain for your crops. You're no longer working the land. You're no longer doing any of the things that God established you to do. All the parables and metaphors that he uses in the Bible in order for you to understand your relationship with him, it replaced it. What about the arts? Oh, so cultured, so cultured. You go to the opera. Oh, you go and you watch theater and musicals and plays. You paint images of Jesus. The arts. Think about how the arts have transformed and defined culture for the worst. So is he speaking something to us? Can he drop science into the sea? Can he catch this all in flames? All of these things that have taken us away from him and changed the way that he established us to live. Can he do it or not? And is he speaking something to us or not? Because I don't know about you, but after my fancy, getting my doctorate and having all those businesses and all that wealth, all I want to do is shrink down to the life that God intended us to have. I want to bake bread. I want to take care of my family. I want to blow out the yard, and spend time with my grandchildren. One here, one on the way. That's all I want to do. I want to live a godly life in a godly home and share these stories, these testimonies of faith and what God is doing in each of us on a daily basis. That's what I do with my kids. That's the life I live. And that's all I want. I don't want any of this world anymore. Even if I got everything that I ever wanted in this world, I don't want it anymore. I don't care about my credit, my clothes, my shoes, my handbags. I don't care. Throwing out your idols like a menstrual cloth. That's what God says we're going to do. My children and I are foreigners in this land. We don't belong here and we don't want it. It is no longer appealing to us. I realized right now that I was going to tell you something about that experience of God taking us out of medicine and science through the process of what we were experiencing. I mean, I had already been out of it, okay? So I had already not been to a doctor in many, many years. But just because God shows me something doesn't mean my children don't have to go through their own thing. Well, they did. I mean, they were definitely tested, and God exposed the field of medicine. And my daughter ended up having Jeremiah at home and completely stepping away from medicine altogether, not only for the delivery, but also relinquishing the doctoral degree that she had worked so hard for so many years. God's going to take these things out of you continually through this covenant. Do not expect to go through something and then be comfortable. Don't start thinking like, wait a minute, I've paid my dues, or I've, done all of this, and therefore I deserve some comfort in this life. Because you will never be comfortable in this life. The whole point is for you to become uncomfortable. If you were comfortable here, and if the world loved you, and if they spoke well of you, it would be because you belonged to it. So life is going to get really uncomfortable. It's the whole reason why God talks about putting you through the fire. He doesn't talk to you about getting in a hot bubble bath or a sauna or a jacuzzi. He's not like, well, get in, you'll get used to it. You don't get used to it. By the time you have a little bit of reprieve, he's on to the next thing until you are finally purified, made spotless, and refined. I asked my daughter the other day, how are you feeling? And she said, I feel like I'm melting. I feel like I'm in a furnace and I'm melting. Okay, that's what it should feel like. And the reason he uses those metaphors and talks about purified, made spotless, and refined, because he's talking about the process of making gold. When you make gold, you're melting that gold, and the impurities are separating from the gold, and that's how you end up making pure gold. That's what's happening with you. The metaphor was established for you, not the other way around. So I want to show you what he requires. I want to show you what it is that he has said from the very beginning in his word, what he was teaching his people regarding the requirement to not set up human idols. Numbers 14:9. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Now, I want to tell you something. We had someone with us in the body at one time who, heard other people being rebuked for not observing Sabbath, kept super quiet about the things they were doing on Sabbath, apparently. And when it was discovered that they were still working on Sabbath, they made a conscious decision to leave the body. They said, I know that God is testing me right now, but I'm going to leave, because they were more afraid of their boss than they were of God. And the crazy thing is that in the very beginning, they had prayed. When God first started drawing them to himself, they had prayed and said, I'll take any job. I'll take any job that you want to give me. I just want to have more time with you. And God made a way for them to stay at the same company they were working at and to have more time with him. So God proved himself, and yet they were not willing to look at what God had done, because you're going to see in scripture that God will continue to say, now remember, I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. I'm the God who's done all these things. And this is what I'm telling you I'm going to do. Are you going to believe in me or not? You see, a lot of times what happens is, in the beginning, when God is drawing us to himself, he's proving himself to us, kind of like you do when in a wooing situation between a man and a woman. You're showing the person who you are or who you can be. And what happens is, a lot of times early Christians will look at that and they'll think that has something to do with them. Oh, how holy and righteous you must be that God is doing that for you. No, that's what God is doing because of who he is. And then when the fire comes, when the covenant comes, they're like, oh, I'm out. I didn't sign up for this. Read the parable of the sower. The worries of this life and wealth choke what was sown. The devil is able to come along and peck at that seed, that gospel that was sown, because it doesn't have any root. It's shallow, it's superficial. They did not bury this deeply in their hearts. What God is doing when he calls you to himself says everything about him. From that point forward, what he brings you through will say something about you, and it will also say something about him and the way that he is able to keep you in the faith if you are fanning into flame his Holy Spirit and you're receiving his ministry. This is a two-way covenant. This is not a one-way covenant. It is not unilateral. Even in the world, you understand that. You don't need a contract for something you just want to give someone. Well, your covenant is your contract, guys. He taught this from the beginning of raising his people. He's going to have to work this through us. We have to prove that we have placed no one above his sovereignty and that we fear him alone. Can you imagine how the Israelites must have felt being told to go in and take lands? I mean, who were they? No one, except that God was with them, and God told them to go and take those lands. And not only did he tell them to go and take those lands, they weren't going in all pompous and whatever. He said, don't be afraid. I'm with you. Do you know what that would have required? Especially when they were seeing, that we were like grasshoppers to them. They were giants. They were huge. These are powerful nations with powerful armies. They're threatening us. These are all the things that God's people have dealt with over time in the Bible. You remember how the king of Assyria through Sennacherib was, threatening Judah and saying, don't believe what Hezekiah, when Hezekiah says that the Lord is with you. Have we not taken over, this land and that land? What's the Lord going to do for you? He was blaspheming, really speaking against God. And they were terrified. Or what about that northern kingdom of Israel trying to come against Judah? Terrified. They were so scared. It says that they were scared like trees shaken in a forest. And what does God say? It will not happen. And he says in Isaiah 7, if you don't stand firm in your faith, you won't stand at all. It's not going to happen, Lord, but what about all the things that they're doing? What about what they're saying? What about how they're advancing against us? It will not happen, is what he says. So if you think I'm crazy for remembering the things that God has said to me, remembering that when he called me, he said, I set you up here, that when my tenant moved out from one of the units on my property, that he said, you're to save this house for your family, not rent it out. That when it came down to, okay, well, what am I going to do now that I'm not working? Am I going to sell these properties and go and buy something in a remote area, which is what I really want to do, is to get away from everybody? No, you are to stay in the place I set you up when I called you. Okay, all right. Well, then am I going to sell the building and that's going to be the thing that pays for this house? No, you're not to sell the building. Okay. None of the things that I wanted to do. I don't want all of this responsibility. It's a lot of responsibility. Am I going to believe what the world has told me, that the world has some sort of power over me? Or am I going to remember and believe what God has done and what he has told me, even when it sounds crazy? I know what my decision is. I'm not going to turn back now. Numbers 21:34, the Lord said to Moses, do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands, along with this whole army, his whole army and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon. His purpose in all of this is starting to come into view. So just like the situation with Jeremiah's delivery and coming out of dependence on medicine, and now we look back at that situation and it's like, why would we ever hand ourselves and our children, the people we love, over to some human beings who have but a breath in their nostrils? We know our covenant. We know what God is capable of. We know how he's proven himself. We will never trust in that. And it's the same thing he's doing right now, just with a different thing, with a different idol that has been deeply ingrained, deeply embedded in our hearts. And it hurts. It hurts when you're pulling something out of your heart like this. He's going to be glorified. And you know what? A lot of the people, there were so many people here when all of that was happening, and they saw him be glorified, and they're no longer here. And so I think about, people who are watching this happen right now, and I wonder, are they going to believe? And it reminds me of when Abraham in the parable of the rich man says to the rich man is telling him, well, if I can't go over there where you are, then go tell my brothers, tell my family how bad it is here in hell. And Abraham says, if they have the prophets, if they don't believe them, they're not going to believe even if someone is raised from the dead. So many people saw that miracle, heard the agony that I was in, as medicine was saying, this baby's going to die, and, fear mongering and trying to get her to do procedures and all kinds of things. Nothing ever happened. God made everything perfect. Nothing that they spoke ever happened. Just like with those experts that I finally had the money to go and consult with, nothing ever materialized. You know why? Because God's in control of that. And so when I did not submit to God, but I submitted to those experts, he foiled it. But when she did not submit to the experts, but submitted to God, he made everything perfect. That is the healthiest, strongest child I think I've ever seen in my life. God did that. And if we had gone to medicine, I guarantee you it would not have been that way. And in fact, we have a family member who did completely defer to medicine, and their child is coming up on a year, I think, just behind Jeremiah, 2 months behind Jeremiah, so it's probably a year and a half, and has had a feeding tube this entire time. This entire time has had a feeding tube. Oh yeah, do whatever you want. Cut me open, take the baby out. Whatever you guys want, just put it on my insurance. I know you will. Separated from her mother for the first several months of her life and continues to be on a feeding tube to this day. Deuteronomy 1:17. Do not show partiality in judging. Hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Bring me any case too hard for you, and I will hear it. Deuteronomy 1:21. See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it as the Lord your God, the God of your ancestors, told you. Don't be afraid. Do not be discouraged. I'm telling you, some of the thoughts that I have had lately are like, I'm going to be taken away to a psych ward and stuck with needles and medications. Everyone's going to hear about how I've gone crazy for believing in God. But this is what he shows me in his word. This is exactly the covenant. This is exactly what he brings us through. The only reason it's foreign to us is because none of these worthless shepherds in marketplaces that they're calling churches are doing this or are preaching this. There are no examples of what the covenant actually looks like. That is what God is providing for you in the testimony of the witnesses. Are you using it? Are you really planting this in your heart, or are you just pulling up the popcorn? Deuteronomy 7:18, but do not be afraid of them. Remember well what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. Remember what he's done. Remind yourself of what he's done. He established himself up front with his people to know who he is. He says, I made a name for myself, a reputation. He showed them who he was. And then he taught them, do not be afraid of anyone, but to know that he is God and will fight for us. How can we be afraid of anything? Deuteronomy 20 verse 1. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, listen, you see all these things and you're terrified because they're greater than you. An army greater than yours. Do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt will be with you. And elsewhere in scripture, he says, all those people, he rebukes and says that he's going to destroy all those who have relied on Egypt, who've relied on Assyria, who've relied on Babylon, who have relied on their chariots and their horses. He says that when he's bringing them low, that they start saying, we're going to flee. We're going to flee on our chariots. We're going to flee on our horses. And he says, go ahead and flee. And I'm going to make your pursuer swifter than you. Who's in charge of everything? What do you believe? Because there are a lot of so-called powers that be in this world that have no power. What will they do? Did God not demonstrate himself with COVID? Because you can't tell me, oh, well, I didn't see what he did when he brought the Israelites out of Egypt. You've seen him. You've seen what he can do. You're not holding on to it. We have to be brought into a position to really know this in our hearts, which means all doubt has to go, and we have to wait on him without taking things up by the work of our hands or deferring to those called experts in the world. Deuteronomy 20, verse 8. Then the officers shall add, is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened too. Now, I want to say something about this. It reminds me a little bit of when God told Gideon to have the men who were afraid go back down the hill, go back down Mount Gilead, leave the army. And I want you to hear how he says this, because it seems to imply, along with the army with Gideon's army, that we cannot bring down the rest of the body with our unbelief, but that, as the word says, we are supposed to lift up, build up the body with belief. And that unbelief is not going to be tolerated by God. You'll be kicked out. You want to say, oh, you're in an army, but look what happens. Look, we've had a lot of people in the body come and go. The only ones left now are me and my kids. Where are all those people? I mean, so many people talking about wanting to be Christian soldiers. Oh, they want to be an army. If it was a matter of your flesh, sure, okay, so go fight that battle. But this is a matter of the heart. This is a matter of faith. This is a matter of standing in your faith. And those people couldn't do it. And the word says that this is a very difficult covenant, that it's hard for the righteous to be saved, that this is a small remnant. These are people who are saying, oh, yeah, I'm standing in faith with you, Carrie. I'm standing in faith. But when that one thing was brought to light that they were not doing, or that they were doing incorrectly, they bailed. That one thing that they were corrected on, and they refused to make the covenant more important than the life they're living in the world, more important than the fears they have with their kids or their bosses or whatever else. Unbelief is not tolerated by God. Deuteronomy 31:6, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, I'm going to be really honest that this has been extremely difficult, wondering why it is that he's not fulfilling, and is he going to forsake? No, he can't. He can't. Not because of me, but because of who he is. He can't. It's impossible. It's impossible that he's still moving in my life and speaking to me, but in this one issue, he requires me to wait and to have faith. As he keeps revealing himself, it's not as though he's left me. It's not as though I'm like, King Saul, who lost the Spirit of God. There's no way. There's no way. He would have to not be real, and there's no way. Not for a single second have I denied that he is real. I know what he's done with me. I know what he's done with my children. I know the miracles that I saw him do in people who were in the body who chose to leave. That's on them. That is not on him. I know that God is real. And so we have to be brought to a place where we don't just say with our lips that we believe, but we live with our life that we believe. We have to believe in who he is. Thinking that he's going to forsake or isn't faithful is a denial of who he is and what he's done. He's done the harder things, like bringing my family in and bringing them in agreement by his Spirit. There was a time when that was very painful. I was alone. I had no one. God had brought me in. He'd given me eyes to see certain things, and my kids didn't yet believe. And then he brought my daughter in. And then he brought my son. But in between, there was a whole lot of painful grief. He's real. He's revealed himself to us. And we joke around that my son-in-law is really stubborn, but I'm going to tell you right now, we're all stubborn. There's no way that any one of us, my daughter, myself, my son-in-law, there's no way that any one of us would have been like, and especially my son-in-law and myself, because we've had experiences, really negative experiences with counterfeit Christianity and manipulation and things like that in the way that we were raised. My daughter to maybe a lesser extent. But we had wounds over it. So there was like no way anyone's going to tell us what to believe. There's no way we're going to drink the Kool-Aid. Like, God had to minister to us. So we make the joke that, that he's really stubborn. But the truth is, my daughter is just, I can't even bring myself to say that she's stubborn. She's just so good. But he and I are really stubborn. Something else that I feel in this whole situation, going through it with my family and going through it with people who I know actually have faith and are believers, in contrast to what I experienced with people who did not believe and were lukewarm and lazy, I can feel the way that God is building us together. First as individuals, but then he's building us together. And it's like, I mean, how do I explain this? I mean, the testimony that's being built together is really like the mortar bringing together the bricks, bringing together the living stones in this temple. And when I think back on people who were with us previously, there was always this breach being presented, a breaching being able to truly be built together because they weren't getting it. And the breach represented a lack of faith and understanding about God and what he's been doing with us. My kids and I understand this because we're living it and we're leaning into it. It feels different and it feels important to distinguish because from the very beginning, God taught the Israelites to keep Israel pure and to purge the evil from among them. Unbelief is evil, and we've seen it over and over and over in the body. And that makes me appreciate the hard work that he's done in each of us to make sure that we are living this out. But it also makes me appreciate the hard work that we've done for one another in bearing one another. Because I am not more afraid of confronting my kids than I am of God. And they are not more afraid of confronting me than they are of God. And so all of us are doing the work within our house. Remember, your house has to be in order before you can serve in God's house. We hold each other accountable. We're sharing with one another on a daily basis what God is doing in each of us. We're building each other up, and this is how it's supposed to be in the body. But I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it yet with anyone but my kids. I've seen some people get a glimpse of it. I've seen them approach it, but when it came down to having to bear their own covenant, they were lukewarm. And some of them just outright lazy with their own children. I just don't understand that. How can you do that with your own children? How can you think that you're saved and not go and repent with your own children and deal with your sin between you and God so that that can be lifted off of their necks? Do you know that God says that those who do not provide for their own house are worse than unbelievers? And he's not just talking about financial provision. Do you think about that for a minute? Think about people who financially provide for their house, but they're totally disconnected from everyone. There's no way that God is saying that that's okay. You have to provide spiritual food, physical food, and spiritual food for your family, for your house. If you're unwilling to do that, you're worse than an unbeliever. And this doesn't mean going around lecturing people. It means that you live this out first in your own life, in your own covenant, and that you ask God to lead you and to teach you how to manage your own house, how to manage really the house that is on loan to you. You're not going to have your spouse in eternity as your spouse. You're going to be married to Christ. Those children are children of God. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have a special connection with them in eternity if you actually are going to be in eternity. And I hope you are. But the reality is that these people who are in your life belong to God. They've been placed on loan to you. God has entrusted you with these people. How are you doing with that? Because the word says that if you don't do well with the trust he's given you, you won't be given more. And the word says that those who do well with the trust he's given them are going to be given more. And there's no way that you're going to serve in God's house if you haven't done that. The word is clear. We are to remember what he's done, and we are not to be afraid of man. We are to remember what he's promised and to stand in the faith, in the hope of that promise when it's not even in our hands, when their chariots and their horses look a lot more powerful than us. And I'm not just giving you lip service. This is the reason I share my testimony. My situation, by all appearances, looks pretty hopeless, doesn't it? Do I sound like a person who's lost her mind? If I have, then so be it. But I've lost my mind for Christ. I've lost my mind for many stupid things in my life, but this time I've lost my mind for Christ. And that's exactly where I need to be. To become a fool so that I can become wise. God is not going to forsake a person who's done that. I'm not concerned about what any human being thinks of me. Not you, not anybody else. I'm not trying to please man over God. I'm not trying to trust man over God or fear man over God. And I could not have gotten to this place. I don't know how much further he's going to take me, but I couldn't have gotten to this place. I couldn't have even known that I needed to get to this place. I couldn't have even known the places inside of myself where I needed to go in order to be brought to this level of faith. But I've received the ministry that he has continued to do in me. I've not gotten up and said, you know what, I'm turning my back. I'm done. This is too hard. I'm not going to do it. I don't trust him. I don't believe him. He's not doing it, so I'm mad. I haven't done that. I've gotten up every day and continued to do the work that I teach you. I've continued to work my heart into what he's molding my heart into. I've continued to test myself and check myself and examine my thoughts and sort through these things with him. And because of that, I bear the fruit right now. Right now, I bear the fruit of being his, provided that I continue to bear the fruit of being his. Then I will be saved. Right now, I bear that fruit. That's the covenant. No one is going to snatch us out of his hands. He has the ability to discipline us and to bring us to the places that we couldn't have brought ourselves. This is not a unilateral covenant. This is not a magic wand. When God says that with man, these things are impossible, but with God, all things are possible, this is what he's describing. He has the ability to bring you there, and he has the ability to make you stand. But you have to receive it. You have to cooperate. Please discern this message with God.